Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jeff and we started talking about historical inspirations for RuneQuest. This is a little guide on what you might be interested in pursuing from literature, from history, and from just inspirational sources in general that will help you when you decide to play RuneQuest. Enjoy it and subscribe to our channel.
Yeah, and this is when thinking about what's unique about RuneQuest. I said, when thinking about this, I'd recommend reading some Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell. My own personal preference would be to actually start with instead of starting with Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. I actually suggested going with a very obscure but influential Carl Jung book called the Red Book, which is the basis, by the way, of why we call it the Red Book of Magic. And what this was a book that Carl Jung wrote right around the time of World War I, while he was having a nervous breakdown, and he prohibited it from being published until after he was dead, because it's totally batshit crazy. And the reason I recommend stuff like that is that it's worth knowing and getting a feel for archetypes and how we approach archetypes. And I actually prefer Jung over Campbell or Eliade, because when you're reading Jung, it's not tied to any particular culture. It's usually to our own archetypes in our own dreams and our own stories. It might be Arthur. It might be I had a freaky nightmare. And it gets us away from trying to do historical recreation. And then I also suggested Gene Wolfe's Soldier of the Mist. I don't know if you're familiar at all with Gene Wolfe.
That's one of my blind spots.
It's a series in the 1980s. It's a sci-fi fantasy fiction series about this you don't know if he's Greek or Italian or what, but basically the soldier during the Persian Wars who is cursed by the gods to never remember anything the following day. So it basically goes through these 24-hour periods where he can remember everything that's going on in this 24-hour period, but the next day he's forgotten it all. And in order to remember it, to know anything, he writes it all. He writes everything down obsessively, and sometimes his scrolls get taken away from him. And when he wanders through Greece, he doesn't know better than to just take the place names and people's names literally. So Chosen of Apollo, or I believe it's the Spartans that are called the rope makers, because he just wanders around, and so you have this weird fantasy land, but everything is in archetypes as opposed to the names. And so you break yourself out of the idea that you're doing you need to have some sort of great historical knowledge to appreciate this. And then I would actually suggest getting a couple of less well-known but mythologically really important stories, like Inanna's descent into the underworld, or something, short stories, easily accessible. I wouldn't go into a deep dive into history. I actually think that defeats the purpose of this. I think it's more important to get for RuneQuest and Gloranthan. I think it's more important to get ourselves into the mindset of the ancients and in the pre-modern world, but not worry about, did people make their swords this way or that way, or any of the sort of stuff that a lot of people care about. It's more, how do I get myself out of this modern mindset into that of the ancient world where gods and spirits are everywhere.
And you think the best way to do that is not necessarily to go and read about, Persia or Gaul or Egypt, just to start to dive into the ideas of archetypes, because they are more timeless. They go over human culture globally.
Yeah, and because in the end, a lot of history books are a collection of dates and events. They're cool. I love history. But there aren't that many that really get us thinking about what it means to live in a world where we believe that the gods are real and that the myths, mythology is really that the underpinning of how everything is, where there's spirits everywhere, where we do things because we have reasons of cult, of tribe, and of tradition, and that often fly in the face of modern assumptions about how people should act. And to me, that's a great thing to broaden our mind. But
I hear that it's not necessarily wise to dive into a lot of dates. And I think that's good, because I know a lot of people who would want to go and have to learn, a history of the ancient world. That said, I did have something explained to me when I was first starting with RuneQuest and Gloranthan, where someone said, think of the Lunar Empire kind of as Rome. And of course, once I actually got into the setting, that became a lot more complicated. But I found that a really helpful portal in, and I didn't go and dive in much into the history of Rome, not what beyond sort of I'd already absorbed from games and movies and books and things like that. Do you have any stylistic touchstones? Not stuff that people have to dive into, but hey, have you considered just exploring the basic information about this group or that group, because you might find it interesting to your gameplay?
Well, yeah. Outside of the three things that I mentioned, if you wanted to go further, I would really suggest looking at one source or one genre of historical studies that I think is really valuable is to think about Alexander and his successors. And the reason I pick Alexander and the successors particularly is, if you think about Alexander the Great, here's this guy who inherited his father's kingdom at about 20, 21 years old. And he went on over the next dozen years and completely changed the world. Completely changed the world. There were Greek colonies set at the edge of what is today's China. Not just the easy stuff like defeating Persia or conquering Egypt. The usual sorts of crazy ambitions. But he expanded an entire world. But he also had to. He went on very strange religious or cultural changes. When he went to the oracle at I think it was at Siva, in what is now the Western Egypt, he either became convinced or decided he wanted to convince others that he was a son of Zeus. And so he was one of the first recorded people in at least in Greek history that decided that, well, I'm actually I'm a guy right now. I'm not a legendary figure. I'm this guy, and I'm also the son of a god. Deal with it. And to me, that's so very Gloranthan. Especially if we eliminate our, the 2,000 years of critical filters that we have for dealing with the ancient world, where it's, well, clearly Alexander was trying to manipulate people in a cynical ploy. If we think about it and say, well, this is what he said, this is what he did, maybe he believed it. Was that mad? Was that crazy? Well, I don't know. I mean, certainly after him for centuries, many of his successors took the same approach, and certainly had that accepted. And the other thing I find really fascinating about that period is how incredibly multicultural it was. You know, Alexander was a Macedonian Greek, which meant he was barely Greek from the perspective of people in places like Athens. His successors, many of them, certainly the Seleucids, and these were the warlords that ended up taking everything from Syria, what is now Syria, to Afghanistan. They had many Persian queens. And so they themselves, although they identified themselves as Macedonian, what does that even mean? And what does any of this mean when we're dealing with these cultures all mixing together and interacting and people wearing different hats depending on where they are? I find that for fantasy a far richer source than Rome, and partially also because we have a received Rome, which is quite different than the real Rome. Mary Beard, who is a fantastic English historian, does a really good job of pointing out how much broader and more diverse the actual Roman Empire was from what our I like to think of it as our conception is basically I Claudius. You know, wasn't the Roman aristocracy? Weren't they a bunch of English Shakespearean actors, all sitting around being, you know, good upper class Englishmen, right? And of course, no, not at all. But anytime we deal with Rome, you've got to get around the received Rome that we have. Whereas if you deal with Alexander and the successors, you're just dealing with a weird world where people proclaim themselves gods, new gods show up all the time. You have a transmission of ideas from Ashoka, who is the emperor of much of India, sent out Buddhist missionaries to most of the Hellenistic centers. So you have this incredible change of cultures and of ideas. And to me, it's very Gloranthan.
I did not realize that about Alexander the Great. I didn't know a lot of that nuance.
One of the other things that's interesting about, if you dive into Alexander and his successors, is how important women were in these leadership groups. You know, many of us know the stories of Alexander's mother, Olympias, who was an ambitious and powerful woman in her own right. Yeah, even in the ancient world, there were those that suggested or hinted that she may have been somehow involved in the assassination of King Philip, Alexander's father, and her husband. Mm-hmm. But she also raised armies and led them in her own right. Alexander's half-sister raised armies in her own right and fought in battles. You have this, unlike in the Roman Empire, where female authority had to always be hidden and be behind the scenes. With Alexander and his family, you know, you had from time to time, you had women that just ruled in their own right and were powerful in their own right. And that also, to me, is more Gloranthan. It's you have this much less restrictive band of people that could be powerful. You basically had all sorts of people proclaim that they're powerful because, by gosh, by Zeus, I'm powerful, and my brother was Alexander the Great, and I may be a woman, but you know, my brother conquered the world, and that makes me pretty special. And to me, I find that's also puts a different touch on things.